to welcome you back to the 2022 Symposium of Irish Studies in South America, Commemoration or Celebration. It is a great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Maria Teresa Caneda Cabrera, who is senior lecturer at the University of Vigo, where she coordinates the NETEC research group on textual and cultural negotiations in Anglophone literature. She is the author of La estética modernista como práctica de resistencia and A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, a re-evaluation of the ideological implications of modernist aesthetics in the context of Joyce's early fiction, and the editor of Vigorous Joyce, Atlantic Readings of James Joyce. She sits on the editorial board of European Joyce Studies since 2010 and has been a guest speaker at the Dublin James Joyce Centre, the Trieste Joyce School, the Cornell University Institute for European Studies, and the Zurich James Joyce Foundation, among others. She has published extensively in the field of Irish studies, specifically in the areas of Joyce Studies and translation studies with a focus on Irish themes. In the last few years, she has combined her expertise in Joyce Studies with her interest in contemporary Irish literature and culture. She has coordinated several state-funded research projects, and since September 2021, she is the principal investigator of the new project In Truths 2, Articulations of Individual and Communal Vulnerabilities in Contemporary Irish Writing. She is currently working on the edition of a volume on narratives of the unspoken in contemporary Irish fiction, and is the editor of two forthcoming books, Telling Truths, Evelyn Conlon and the Task of Writing, by Peter Lang, Reimagining Ireland Series 2022, and Atlantic Communities, Translation, Mobility, Hospitality, Routledge 2022. There will be time at the end of this talk to answer questions that you may have about this speech titled, The Modern Writer Must Be an Adventure, Commemorating 100 Years of James Joyce, Ulysses. So Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mariana. I have to say, allow me to say before I start that I am extremely thankful to the organizers here in Buenos Aires and in Argentina and Brazil for the invitation to come here. Not even in my sweetest dreams during the tough and rough confinement days would I have dreamt of coming here today for this wonderful conference. So I'm really very, very thankful. And I'm very proud also to be here representing the Spanish Association of Irish Studies, AEDEI. And I'm not of Irish ancestry, despite my ostentatious wearing of the green. Actually, I am a Gallega. I'm from Galicia, and I've always wanted to come here because in our imaginary, Buenos Aires is our 5th province, the largest capital, the capital in the world with the largest population of Galician inhabitants. So it's great to be here for obvious reasons. And also because the Galicians, we pride ourselves in the fact that we are Celts and we have so much in common with the Irish. I think it's a wonderful triangle or whatever this is. So I'm really, really delighted to be here. It's wonderful. So thanks again for the hospitality and thank you for the invitation. And I hope what I have to share with you today is of interest. I'll be talking about ways of thinking about Joyce's Ulysses 100 years after the publication of the novel. So for a long time now, a great deal of the studies devoted to James Joyce seem to have oscillated between two critical positionings, explicitly based on the establishment of an opposition between two critical discourses. Broadly speaking, I'm referring here to the opposition between two poles represented on the one hand by the readings which have traditionally favored a dominant view of Joyce as a practitioner of international modernism, a writer committed to the European avant-garde who embraces the cosmopolitan and the universal, and on the other hand, those which have encouraged his portrayal as an Irish writer, an author for whom Ireland and the idea of Ireland played a special role. Certainly, I believe that Joyce provides an interesting case for the study of changes affecting the shaping and institutionalization of literature in general and modernism in particular. As I have discussed in my work, the symptomatic emergence of a large number of publications concerned with the revision of the topic of Joyce and modernism in the past few years has definitely invigorated the exploration of the intricate relations between literary modernism and the historical contingencies of modernity. But more than anything, what these critical oscillations have revealed is that modernism and thus modernist writers have historically been examined through competing and often contradictory discourses. As in the Joycean image of the distorting mirror, which Stephen Dedalus proclaims a symbol of Irish art in the first episode of Ulysses, modernism turns out to be a sort of cracked mirror, a sort of cracked looking glass where the fractured reflections reduplicate a shifting image that can never be seen or grasped in a unified way. This intricate tangle of contradictions becomes exceptionally visible when one explores the critical reception of Joyce himself, whose works have traditionally been read, as I have suggested, in strong association with the different views on modernism. To complicate things more, from the post-colonial front not so long ago, criticism restored the discussion of Joyce to the colonial politics of its production, reconceiving the aesthetics of its modernism in relation to the politics of post-colonial resistance. And likewise, his presumed opposition to the Celtic revival and Irish nationalism has been revised through new readings which argue that Joyce's text must be reconsidered within the context of nationalism, as he was not immune to revivalist romanticism and primitivism, but rather he concentrated on offering ironic meta-commentaries on the question of national identity. Ultimately, to echo Molly Bloom's question in the Calypso episode of Ulysses, as she demands an explanation in plain language for the word metempsychosis, which is found in a novel, and I quote, "Who is he when he is at home? The transmigration of the souls," explains her husband Leopold. "Oh, rocks," she complains, "tell us in plain words." But there is no easy or simple answer for that question, who is he when he is at home, when applied to Joyce, since to further expand the echo, he keeps on reincarnating in different guises through different critical and theoretical approaches, which have constructed him and his texts, specifically Ulysses, as a sort of global artifacts. Joyce the modernist, Joyce the Irishman, Joyce the cosmopolitan, Joyce the nationalist, Joyce the canonical writer, Joyce the peripheral writer, Joyce the elitist, Joyce the popular writer, Joyce the male chauvinist, Joyce the feminist. Yet it's not my intention today to account for the transmigration of Joyce's soul, so to speak, throughout the history of Joyce Studies. Rather, as I suggest in my title, I will intend to briefly contemplate and share with you the multidimensional nature of Ulysses as a modernist and adventurous text, which 100 years later is still globally invoked by everybody and virtually read by nobody. A century, okay, see if this works, great. A century after it was first published, Ulysses still stands as the climax of high modernism and a revolutionary moment in the history of Western literature. Everybody agrees today with the contention that Ulysses is one of the masterpieces of modernism, and that apart from many other things, the novel is a statement about the modern condition of life and modern art. This canonization of Joyce's novel in the modernist pantheon is so evident by now that it seems obligatory that any critical attempt to understand modernism must always include a careful consideration of Ulysses, seen precisely as a paradigmatic and a classic modernist text. But the modernist shaping of Ulysses is not indeed a post-Joycean or post-modernist construction. Contemporary reviewers, whether hostile or sympathetic already tended to see the novel as a key text that was clearly constitutive of modernism. In his early review, Ulysses, Order and Myth, printed in the November 1923 issue of the modernist literary journal, The Dial, a year after Ulysses was first published in Paris, T.S. Eliot highlights the significance of the novel to its specific time and to the particular conditions of the modern age. He declares Ulysses to be, and I quote, the most important expression which the present age has found, a book to which we are all indebted and from which none of us can escape, end of quote. For Eliot, at a time when the war had wasted the essence of a cohesive civilization, which had been reduced to fragments and ruins, Joyce's Ulysses represented, both in its form and content, the process of dislocation which affected a whole culture. He famously writes that, and I quote, "It is simply a way of controlling or ordering, of giving a shape and a significance to the immense panorama of futility and anarchy, which is contemporary history," end of quote. As Eliot saw it, it was only through a self-conscious mock epic, which parodied the master narrative of old unified myths and languages, that a modern writer like Joyce would find a way of giving sense to the senselessness of the age. Another contemporary modernist writer, Virginia Woolf, I really like that picture of Virginia Woolf looking defiant, who was only 8 days older than Joyce. She had referred to Joyce in her essay, Modern Fiction, written in 1919 and then published again in the Common Reader in 1925 in the following terms, and I quote, "He discards most of the conventions which are commonly observed by the novelists," end of quote. She praises Joyce's experimental style, his new methods to capture modern consciousness, his efforts to liberate the novel from the material solidity, and his focus on the energy flowing incessantly from the life of the mind. Joyce is spiritual, she writes. At all costs, he aims to reveal the flickerings of the innermost flame, which flashes its myriad messages through the brain. He disregards with complete courage whatever seems to him adventitious, though it be probability or coherence or any other of the handrails to which we cling for support when we set our imagination free. Woolf amplifies her praise for what she calls the brilliancy of the Hades chapter. And I quote, "On a first reading, at any rate," she says, "it is difficult not to acclaim it a masterpiece. If we want life itself, here we surely have it," end of quote. Part of what makes Ulysses so important for Eliot and Woolf, therefore, is its radical departure from the traditional novel form in its attempt to come closer to life. In writing the novel, Joyce took great care to come closer to Irish life. And in order to represent the Dublin of June 16th, 1904, as accurately as possible, he checked maps and street directories. He timed routes, wrote many letters to friends and family to check minute local details. Through the writing of Ulysses, which took him 7 years, from 1914 to 1921, hundreds of miles away from Dublin in the cities of Trieste, Zurich, and Paris, Joyce often turned to his own Josephine Mary as a source of information. She would supply him with the accurate details of his scrupulous prose fiction. As Richard Ellman notes in his biography of Joyce, he asked her to check, for instance, and I quote, "whether there are trees and of what kind behind the start of the sea church in Sandy Mount visible from the shore, and also whether there are steps leading down at the side of it from Leahy's Terrace," end of quote. Behind this is Joyce's claim that if Dublin were destroyed, it could be rebuilt, using Ulysses as a guide, a very ironical statement indeed. It would be quite an erroneous guide, but still. And yet, Ulysses' meticulous presentation of its world is rendered in an extremely challenging manner, since it combines an astonishing array of narrative techniques that include interior monologue and third-person narrative, interruptive headlines, musical notation, disjointed impersonal narratives, musical prose, parodies of literary English, a hallucinatory play script, a wandering assemblage of contradictions, a scientific catechism, and obviously the much invoked unpunctuated transcription of nighttime thoughts at the end in the final chapter. Okay, so if it is as if Ulysses, pronouncing itself dissatisfied with previous writerly styles, had set to the task of offering pastiches of many of them, and it's precisely through this stylistic diversity how this modernist text takes several risks and makes an explicit stand against the ideological authority of the 19th century novel. Joyce himself declared, the important thing is not what we write, but how we write. And in my opinion, the modern writer must be an adventurer, above all, willing to take every risk and be prepared to founder in his effort if need be. In other words, we must write dangerously. Everything is inclined to flux and change nowadays, and modern literature, to be valid, must express that flux. As critic Karen Lawrence has argued about Joyce's modernist techniques, he adopts, Joyce, a series of rhetorical masks, which makes us doubt the authority of any particular style, precisely because the various methods of narrative in Ulysses are different, but not definitive ways of filtering or ordering experience. Declan Kyver, who in his introduction to the 1992 Penguin edition of Ulysses notes that at the heart of modernist culture is a distrust of the very idea of culture itself, had also remarked, and I quote, Joyce made his parodies the basis of a serious case against literature itself. What makes Joyce a radical writer is his willingness to question not just the expressiveness or powers, not just the expressive powers of language, but also the institution of literature itself. So the most obvious adventurous and modern aspect of Joyce's novel is suggested precisely through the deployment of multiple styles to convey the very multiplicity and multidimensionality of modern life. As mentioned, on the level of accuracy and meticulous, almost obsessive detail, Ulysses offers itself to be read as an evocation of early 20th century Dublin. On the level of the psychological exploration, it provides an unprecedented study of what conforms to human consciousness and individual personality. On the level of form and language, Ulysses has been referred to as an encyclopedia of narrative possibilities. But the novel, which is definitely predicated on the modernist claim expressed by Woolf that everything is the stuff of fiction, is also a statement on the kaleidoscopic nature of human awareness, a text which examines the problematics of national and gender identity and looks at the relations between citizens and the idea of nation, but also explores the relations between generations, between parents and children, between the sexes, between the present and the past, between Catholics and their church, between colony and empire, and certainly between readers and texts. At the same time, through its use of themes from other writers, such as evidently Homer, but also Dante and Shakespeare, and from innumerable sources from literature, philosophy, history, but also journalism, magazine fiction, cinema, music, and popular culture, Ulysses creates a highly intertextual pattern of allusions and suggestions, which ultimately accounts for the dense texture of his damned monster novel, as Joyce himself called this. Some of those who were part of Joyce's inner literary circle were lucky enough to have access to a document which has come to be known as the schema. It contained a column explaining the Homeric titles for the novel's 18 episodes. In September 1920, Joyce sent his Italian friend and translator Carlo Linati a schema with references providing also a clue to its meaning, with an accompanying note in which he explained that the novel was the epic of two races, Israel and Ireland, the Irish, la raza irlandesa, the Irish race, right? And at the same time, the cycle of the human body, as well as a little story of a day. Another recipient of the schema was the French translator of Penelope, the final episode of Joyce's novel, for an event organized in Paris in December 1921. Apparently overwhelmed by the task, who wouldn't be overwhelmed by the task of translating that episode into any language, he requested to see the annotated guide for reading Ulysses. Joyce supplied only part of it and explained in his correspondence, if I give it all up immediately, I'd lose my immortality. I've put in so many enigmas and puzzles that it will keep the professors busy for centuries, arguing over what I meant. That's the only way of ensuring one's immortality. So he did indeed. The most obvious device that Joyce employs is precisely the mythical method, as Eliot calls it, the intertextual parallel with Homer's Odyssey. Every episode in Ulysses, as we know, corresponds in some way to an episode in the Odyssey. As the painter Frank Pagin explains in his James Joyce and the Making of Ulysses, it was during a stroll in Zurich that Joyce told him, and I quote, I'm now writing a book based on the wanderings of Ulysses. The Odyssey, that is to say, serves me as a ground plan. Only my time is recent time, and all of my heroes' wanderings take no more than 18 hours. And as he explained, Ulysses was for him the most all-round character in world literature, shown in all his aspects: coward and hero, cautious and reckless, weak and strong, husband and lover, father and son, sublime and ridiculous. The Greek hero of Homer's Odyssey is now Leopold Bloom, an Irish Jew, an ordinary modern salesman who is in the advertising business. And the 10 years of mythic wandering after the Trojan War are telescoped into the 18 hours of a single day, June 16th, 1904. If in the Odyssey, journeys are heroic and bravery, chastity, and honor are venerated, in Joyce's Ulysses, all of these epic motifs and heroic themes are undermined and parodied. After his aimless and unheroic wanderings through the city of Dublin, Bloom finally returns home where Molly, Joyce's subversive version of Homer's faithful Penelope, does not exactly await him. A new form of heroism is conceived here, that of the trivial details of the ordinary life of individuals existing in the modern world, which Joyce addresses with unprecedented explicitness. The multidimensional aspect of Ulysses is invoked by contemporary novelist Mary Costello in her acclaimed 2019 novel, The River Capture, a self-confessed homage to James Joyce. The main protagonist is so immersed in Ulysses that he thinks in its language and rhythms and obsessively sees constant parallels with Leopold Bloom, Stephen Dedalus, and Joyce himself. And I think many Joyceans do that all the time themselves. In his everyday life, he fantasizes with the idea of founding a private school whose curriculum would be devised using only one source, Ulysses. So the references, allusions, riddles would be explored through the fields of literature, mythology, music, math, science, history, theology, philosophy, arts, ethics, aesthetics, astronomy, biology, embryology, physics, psychology, the earth sciences, languages, politics, law, etc. One text would lead naturally to another, from Plato to pop art. So clearly Ulysses is the work of enormous social and historical registration, and is also rooted in everyday life, in gossip, in desire, in faith, in disbelief, in tragedy, in comedy, in grief, in hope, in denial, in acceptance, in lust, in love. And all of this goes hand in hand with modernist experimentation and adventure. In a recent article in the Irish Times, scholar Catherine Flynn discusses Ulysses in the light of its being a response to the Italian, Swiss, and French avant-garde movements that Joyce encountered while writing Ulysses in the Three Cities, whose importance he signals in the final words of the novel. 1914, if you remember, 1914, 1921, Trieste, Zurich, Paris. In those cities, Flynn reminds us, and I quote, Futurist, Dada, and Surrealist artists used iconoclastic practices to rebel against aesthetic, social, and political norms. And I think this modernist contextualization is indeed extremely relevant. I have myself been concerned with how Joyce, who became a passionate spectator of Italian cinema in Trieste and subsequently worked to establish the first cinema in Dublin in 1909, the Volta Cinema, turns to a specific semiology which heavily relies on the obsession with modern visual spectacles and thus engages with the adventurous modernist cinematic devices typical of the avant-garde films called big city symphonies of the 1920s. In Paris, by the time Ulysses was published in 1922, he had seen a large number of films. In 1924, when his sight had begun to diminish, he wrote in a letter to Harriet Shaw Weaver, activist, publisher, and his benefactor more than anything else, "Whenever I'm obliged to lie with my eyes closed, I see a cinematograph going on, and it brings back to my mind things I have almost forgotten." Unsurprisingly, as in the early 20th century cinema that Joyce became familiar with, Ulysses turns to self-reflexivity through unprecedented technical innovations that challenged the established notions of literary representation in traditional narratives. For example, the use of juxtaposition to suggest simultaneity in the dynamic modern city views in the Wandering Rocks episode, where he introduces a series of narrative devices through which he seeks to translate the powers of the cinematic image into his fictional narrative discourse. As I have argued elsewhere, it is precisely through the cinematic device of montage that the writer questions the notion of consecutiveness and linearity in order to convey multidimensionality. The use of multiple consciousness, the blurring of the distinction between subjective and objective, inner and outer reality, and conscious and unconscious levels of discourse. More specifically, Joyce's ability to visualize verbally in Ulysses, to simulate ocular experiences through framed partial views and the rapid juxtaposition of simultaneous angles of vision deliberately emphasizes a camera consciousness, thus linking his narrative mode to a type of modernist cinema which is predicated upon the persistence of vision. Trieste, Zurich, Paris stands also as an interesting modernist epitaph for Ulysses, because it becomes a mark of the constant movement between places and languages. Joyce wrote about Ireland while he was living between acquired speeches, having to translate himself constantly as an exile, first in the multicultural city of Trieste and in Zurich, city of refugees, and later in cosmopolitan multilingual Paris. In 1915, when the Joyce family moved to neutral Zurich, at the time a destination for First World War refugees like them, the writer found himself in a country whose linguistic identity relied then, as still does today, on linguistic pluralism, as German, French, and Italian comprised the intertwined elements of its multilingual fabric. The fact that Joyce was a gifted polyglot, always eager to improve his knowledge of languages, is clearly demonstrated in the notebook with the title Italiano, written between 1904 and 1910, which contains passages in Italian and exercises dealing with idioms, together with pages devoted to French and lists of German vocabulary. I think everybody learning languages at one point did this, right? These little notebooks. Unsurprisingly, as a writer who spent most of his life speaking acquired languages and moving across different European territories, Joyce calls attention in Ulysses to the inscription of the foreign in the native culture, through the disruption of hierarchies and the estrangement of dominant values on different levels. In the foreword to his emblematic Extraterritorial, the critic George Steiner identifies a clear convergence between the modernist language revolution and the crisis of morals and formal values, which immediately precedes and follows the First World War. For him, one of the most striking aspects of the language revolution, which Joyce is obviously part of, is represented by the emergence of linguistic pluralism or unhousedness in representative figures in the literature of exile. Joyce, for his part, had proclaimed, I'd like a language which is above all languages. And this idea is indeed celebrated in Ulysses, where, as I have been mentioning, Joyce parodies and mocks a large range of styles, registers, and speech patterns, avoiding to express himself in one single language, and thus celebrating linguistic multidimensionality and displaying, through his experimentation with style and form, his sensitivity towards the nature of hybridity and ambivalences. Joyce's writing emerges on different levels as a dialogical hybrid and polyglot, paradoxically evincing a compelling concern with the experience of foreigners, even when writing about his homeland, Ireland. Thus, I would argue, as I have done, that if Ireland, Irish identity and language become the official narratives of his works, they do so by coexisting and often contrasting, ironically, with other sub-narratives which insistently incorporate the experience of being a foreigner, the experience of foreigners from a varied array of perspectives, which become evident in the treatment of language, characterization, and plot conflicts. As has been noted, in Ulysses, Joyce lightly repaints the reality of 1904 Dublin in multicultural tones, subtly but definitely exaggerating the multilingual, multi-ethnic, and immigrant nature of the city's population at the time. This modern Irish epic, the encyclopedia of insider Irish culture, provocatively represents many of the turn-of-the-century Dubliners as either foreigners or attracted by foreigners. In his groundbreaking study, The Years of Bloom, John McCord reminds us that the influence of Trieste as a crossroads of foreign cultures is clearly present in the characters of Leopold and Molly Bloom. And I quote, "They are the testimony to the forces of attraction that made Joyce linger for 10 long years in the Adriatic city, despite his endless travels there." McCord's rigorous examination of the influence of Trieste on Joyce proves fascinating for any discussion of the concern with the attraction to the experience of foreigners of the writer, who candidly declared in a letter to Nora, written from Ireland, "I felt, as I always feel, as a stranger in my own country, and I feel proud to think that my son will always be a foreigner in Ireland, a man speaking another language and bred in a different tradition." As recorded by McCord, Triestino, the local lingua franca that Joyce eventually learned and spoke at home with his family, reunited elements of many other dialects as well as other foreign languages: Armenian, English, Spanish, Turkish, Sicilian, Maltese, German, Hungarian, Slovenian, Croatian, Czech, and Greek. A linguistic wealth which prefigures not only the polyglot but playful experience of Finnegan's Wake, an exaggerated, exploded version of Triestino, according to McCord, but is also present in Ulysses, particularly in the Circe episode, since, and I quote there, "With the exception of Irish, the range of languages spoken during this episode are more representative of a Triestine reality than any Dublin one, precisely the sort of mixture of languages Joyce would have heard late at night in the old city, where the Slovene members of the Austrian police struggled to use the little bit of German to keep drunken Italians in order." Now, the concern with the foreign perspective was indeed essential for Joyce, who chooses a Jew with Hungarian roots and a Dubliner, a confused outsider in the society in which he moves, both exile and citizen, as the protagonist of the novel. Leopold and Molly Bloom are presumably representative native Dubliners, yet they are both strongly characterized by hybrid origins, which become evident not only in the foreignness of their looks, but also in representative aspects of their behaviors. Significantly, the narrator of Oxen of the Sun describes Bloom as an exotic tree transplanted to a climate more temperate. Likewise, in the Nausicaa episode, Gertie McDowell notices him as that foreign gentleman. In Ithaca, we learn that of his Jewishness through a significant reference to his size, his olive complexion, his grown beard, and his black suit. Whereas in Lestrygonians, his choice of snack, Burgundy, olives, and Gorgonzola cheese, make him or mark him as non-Irish, different, just like his breakfast of inner organs, which he eats with relish in Calypso. Bloom also discusses in Imeos the temperament of the blood-warmed Spanish, quote, given to taking the law in their own hands. I don't know if that applies to other Spanish-speaking countries and cultures, but which Stephen describes as well in reference to Molly, emphasizing her foreign attributes, and I quote, the splendid proportions of hips, bosom, you don't simply knock against those kind of women here, and characterizes her as follows. My wife is, so to speak, Spanish, half that is, point of the fact that she could actually claim Spanish nationality if she wanted, having been born technically in Spain. This is Gibraltar. I hope there's no one from Britain here. She has the Spanish type, quite dark, regular, brunette, black. Molly, for her part, is attracted to Bloom because of his foreignness, as we found out in Nausicaa, when he remembers her answer to the question, why me? Because you were so foreign from the others. In Penelope, Molly evokes memories of her past through fragmented and faded verbal reminiscences of her former command of the foreign tongue, Spanish, which are welcome untranslated, both disrupting and simultaneously embracing the dominant language of a stream of thought in the Penelope episode. ¿Cómo está usted? Muy bien, gracias. ¿Y usted? Sí, I haven't forgotten it all. I thought I had. She recalls Gibraltar longing particularly for the multilingual and culturally diverse elements, the Greeks and the Jews and the Arabs and the devil knows who else from all the ends of Europe, and reimagines herself as a young foreign woman when she was a flower of the mountain. When I put the rose in my hair like the Andalusian girls used. So I just want to finish with a few more reflections. I don't know how we're doing with time. I have time. Yes, great. Literary works, I think, do not belong exclusively to the author or those who claim the right to ownership. And certainly in the case of Ulysses, neither Joyce nor the busy professors he mentioned, or the so-called Joycean industry, literary works, if they are truly influential, enter into the public realm and may follow unexpected paths and experience unanticipated lives. Ulysses, as we know, was initially published in installments that appear between 1918 and 1920 in the Little Review, a Chicago-based avant-garde magazine. That serialization was discontinued when obscenity charges were put against the publication with the appearance of the 13th episode, Nausicaa, that triggered action by the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. The two editors, Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap, lost their obscenity trial at the New York Court of Special Sessions, receiving a fine of $50 each and being prohibited. Okay, I have to finish? Yes, okay. And being prohibited from, so I'll just finish this so that it doesn't sound incoherent, and I'll wrap up. And being prohibited from publishing any, you were very subtle about it. In Spain, yes. Will just stop you, you know. So that was a cultural thing. Speaking of foreigners, I thought, you know, how very nice, you were being nice. Okay, so I'm just referring here to that, the case of the obscenity trial, very briefly. And as we know, finally it was published by Shakespeare and Company. And now you can actually venerate the first edition ever, and the first issue at the Museum of Literature Ireland, as there in a sort of altar. So this is an anecdote, but a few years ago there was an exhibition in Galicia, and the idea was how to sort of reflect on Galician culture and identity through 100 objects, and one of the objects was the copy of Ulysses that the Galician translator had at home. So And that is actually a drawing that appeared in La Voz de Galicia, speaking about that. But that's another story. I'll come back some other time and talk about it.
Definitely.
Okay, so I guess this is it. I just wanted to say that, you know, just posing here, Susan Sontag, she talks about great writers, and she says, a great writer of fiction both creates a new, unique individual world through acts of imagination, through language that feels inevitable, and through commanding forms, and responds to the world the writer shares with other people, but that is unknown or misknown by still more people. And I think that either read as a modernist text or invoked as a global artifact, Ulysses is above all remembered, commemorated, celebrated, and even read by some 100 years later as the work of a great writer of fiction, an adventurer who created an exceptionally unique world, which to this day has never stopped expanding our consciences, sympathies, and knowledge. So thank you very much. And I apologize for misunderstanding you.
Thank you, Teresa, for such a fascinating paper. You could stay here for very much longer, but unfortunately, I think we are running late. I'm not sure if we have time for questions. Maybe one, two. Yes, Christina.
Just 1 hour from Buenos Aires city, in the Museo Guiraldes, we have the first copy of the French version of the Ulysses. No, the first copy, it was translated by Shakespeare & Co. In Paris, and with contributions from people from everywhere, I suppose. And I suppose Guiraldes' wife contributed a lot. And we have the first copy of the Ulysses in French. And I don't know, we were told that it was first read in French, but in English.
Right.
That's right.
But, and I'm also very aware of the fact that the first Ulysses actually spoke with an accent from Buenos Aires, because it was, as Lucas sitting there at the back has actually written extensively about. It was first published here, and the translation was by Salas Subirás. And so, you know, I'm well aware of it. And I rented an apartment while I'm here, and it's very close to Corrientes. And I know Salas Subirás had to walk from his place in Florida to Corrientes, and he probably wrote his translations in Corrientes. So I'm thrilled that I'm living so close to the place where Ulysses was first published here in Buenos Aires.
And there is a wonderful translation of the Ulysses by Rolando Costa Picasso, who died last year. And really, I cannot, probably according to my experience, it is the best, but it is an excellent translation, believe me. And you can get it here. It was written, I don't know, 8 years ago, about 8 years ago, or 10. Oh, really? Yes. Oh, a wonderful one. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Every time you go to a place and you talked about Ulysses, you get so much more information back.
So this
great.
is not what I was going to ask you, but Christina's comment. Let me tell you that there are 3 Argentine translations, which is really incredible. See, in 1948, the Salas Subirás translation. Then in this 21st century, one by Savaloy, Marcelo Savaloy, and then the other by Rolando Costa Picasso. That is, it makes us as Argentines, who are so
quite
well depressed on account of many reasons, very proud. Right?
Yeah, I know.
But this was not what I was going to ask you. If you know why Joyce suppressed, did away with the chapters, the names of the chapters, sending us back to the Odyssey. That is, the first they appeared, and then he did away with these indications, with these remarks. Do you know that?
I'm not sure I follow you on the question. I'm sorry.
All right, that I think that in the first edition he kept the Odyssean, the Homeric titles or indications.
Oh, you mean, yeah,
but then
yeah, you're right. Yeah, I
okay.
didn't understand you. Now, I now understand you. You referred to the equivalences for each of the chapters in reference to the Odyssey. I don't know, Joyce, I think it's difficult to sort of decipher what Joyce was about most of the time. But he in this very complex kind of personality, both as a man and as a writer, I think he was very playful. And he also played such a role in a kind of self-promotion. You know, this idea of what you were saying, the idea that I might not want to give too much information because I want to keep this enigmatic and this sort of unfathomable work and have the professors busy for all these years. I think it's part of it. It's part of the kind of promoting his own personality as a writer and in his work as something that could not be deciphered easily, make it difficult.
Okay, so I think we have come to the end of this talk. So Teresa, let's.
Thank you again. Thank you.